Brian Hansbury, thank you so much for joining me on Louisiana Lefty.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, before we get started recording the podcast about media and democracy, I wanted to ask you, because Trump was just announced as being indicted yesterday.
Yeah.
If you have any thoughts on that you can share.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think from the lens of our group, Media and Democracy Project, we're looking at, and we've talked about ahead of time, everyone's sort of been anticipating an indictment since Trump himself made an announcement that his arrest was imminent. We've been anticipating the way that media will cover the indictment, and especially our national political reporters at the most influential outlets in our country. And we've already seen what we would call bad journalism, in the sense that the focus is on sort of almost adopting the right-wing rhetoric of like, we've crossed a Rubicon, right? That phrase was mentioned several times on Fox News yesterday.
Yeah.
Or Fox Propaganda yesterday. So we crossed a Rubicon, and, this is perilous for the country. And, these frames that talk about how these frames that play into the propaganda from the right, that this is somehow a partisan attack or, a hunt of Donald Trump, and it's born of hatred and partisan, toxicity. Whereas Donald Trump is a known criminal actor in several areas of his life for decades.
Right.
His charities have stolen his company has stolen money from charities that he set up. Like, there's just so much criminality, and we want a rule of law in our country. We want for there to be accountability for people in power. And so rather than sort of establishing that as the leading frame of, wow, what a victory for the rule of law, the frames are mostly, wow, we're so polarized. Hey, both sides, everything is crazy. Is this the end of democracy in America? Because perhaps it's just going to be all like partisan attacks and convictions from now on. And I know you wanted to briefly talk about this, but just specifically, Peter Baker did like a 2,000 word, news analysis piece in the Times. And he left out, the corruption of Attorney General Bill Barr, right? He left out that, the ex-president Trump was, already convicted via his corporation in a related investigation. Like, he left out so many things. And that's what we see as a problem with our national political reporting is the way that it frames the indictment.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting. You mentioned Fox, or the Fox Propaganda Network, trotting out Rod Blagojevich, which
wow.
I thought was interesting that they brought him on to comment on this. And I'm like, that's the first piece of evidence that Democrats are not protecting Democrats against prosecution when they've done something illegal. He went to jail. He lost his position in politics and went to jail for that.
Right. Absolutely. And what party was John Edwards?
Right.
Right. So, politicians are indicted way more often than we think.
Right.
And it's reflective of the fact that we still have some semblance of a rule of law in our country. So, yes, I guess in our experience, right, like Democrats are seemingly more willing to hold people to account regardless of, what party that they're a member of.
Well, and I think your organization, or your project, as you call it, is actively working to push back against the media not reporting. What's the word? Accurately? Is that the correct way, or not framing things the way they should? At least that's part of what you guys are doing, right?
Yeah, we push back on framing. What we say is that we seek truth, context, and transparency in every piece of reporting. And so often essential context is left out of reporting, especially national political reporting, or even things that become, hi doggy, or even things that become sort of political reporting because they have been entered into the quote unquote culture war by right-wing politicians and right-wing actors, right? So just a real quick example of that would be like CRT and how that was handled, right? So often in the Washington Post and the New York Times and on cable television and in outlets all over the country, the reality that CRT is not taught in K through 12 schools, the reality that this is really just an attack on American history, it's born of white supremacy, is not addressed really at all in a lot of the coverage from our most influential outlets. So we fight for that. We especially want people to pay attention to those things and pay attention to their media. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we'll talk more about that on the podcast. So sit tight and we'll get to recording that.